Both rulers soon turned greedy eyes toward the weak overseas lands of the Ptolemies. In 202 BCE, Antiochus III began the Fifth Syrian War, aiming to seize the long-disputed regions of Coele, Syria, and Cyprus. At the same time, Philip V of Macedon moved aggressively across the Aegean, capturing several Cycladic islands and cultivating alliances with Greek cities along the western coast of Asia Minor. His expansion alarmed Rhodes and Pergamon, smaller powers determined to resist Macedonian dominance, and in 201 they declared war. Philip responded with speed and brutality. He crushed a joint Rhodian-Pergamene relief force during the siege of Chios, inflicting severe losses, and then marched directly against Pergamon. Although he decisively defeated the Pergamene army in open battle outside the city walls, he failed to capture the city itself. Recognizing that a prolonged siege would only exhaust his troops, Philip abandoned the effort and instead annexed much of Corea and the Rhodian Pariah, laying the foundations of what he envisioned as a renewed Macedonian empire. In the autumn, Philip's fleet clashed with the Rhodians at Lade and, despite fierce resistance, emerged victorious. Yet his position soon weakened. During the winter of 201, a Rhodian fleet trapped him in the Gulf of Bargilia on the Carian coast, where supplies ran dangerously low and the king struggled to feed both himself and his army. The Rhodians understood Philip would eventually escape, but they also knew they were losing the wider conflict. Seeking survival, Rhodes, Pergamon, and Ptolemaic Egypt turned west. Their ambassadors traveled to Rome and warned the Senate of a secret agreement between Philip and Antiochus to divide Ptolemaic territories. These vulnerable Hellenistic states, fearing Macedonian and Seleucid power more than Roman ambition, unintentionally invited Rome into Greek affairs. This decision permanently altered Mediterranean politics and ensured Roman influence would expand steadily throughout the Eastern Hellenistic world for centuries to come. At the same time, Consul Galba launched harsh raids across the Illyrian countryside to prepare the Roman campaign. His most infamous action was the brutal sack of Antiochus, a city so thoroughly devastated that it failed to properly recover until the 5th century CE. Galba then attempted to invade Macedon through the mountain passes, but this effort collapsed due to difficult terrain, poor coordination, and his own declining health. Weak, exhausted, and increasingly ineffective, Galba was soon relieved of command and replaced by Publius Villius Tapulus. Villius inherited an already unstable situation. As he advanced through the region toward Abydos, which he placed under siege, his position rapidly deteriorated. Almost immediately after assuming command, he faced a serious mutiny within the Roman ranks. Around 2,000 veteran soldiers from the Second Punic War believed they had served long enough and demanded to return home to their farms and families. They openly refused to follow orders, leaving the Roman army temporarily paralyzed. To his credit, Villius avoided harsh punishment. Instead, he listened to the soldiers' grievances and promised to formally present their concerns to the Roman Senate. His willingness to negotiate gradually eased tensions and restored a degree of order. With discipline partially reestablished, Villius moved his army forward and established a camp near a narrow gorge along the Aegean River. Unbeknownst to him, King Philip V of Macedon had arrived earlier and positioned his forces in a strong defensive line controlling the main route from Apollonia into Macedon. Shortly after setting up camp, Villius' command ended. He was replaced by Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a young, energetic patrician from the Quinctia family, whose arrival changed the course of the war decisively. At the same time, Consul Galba carried out raids across the Illyrian countryside to weaken resistance ahead of the main campaign. His actions were harsh, most notably the sack of Antiochus, a city so completely devastated that it would not recover until the 5th century CE. Despite this destruction, Galba failed in his strategic aim. His attempt to invade Macedon through the mountain passes achieved little, and his declining health soon made him ineffective as a commander. As a result, he was replaced by Publius Villius Tapulus. Villius took command under difficult circumstances. Advancing through the region, He reached Abydos and placed the city under siege, but his authority was immediately challenged. A mutiny erupted among the Roman legions soon after his arrival. Around 2,000 veterans of the Second Punic War, exhausted after years of service, believed they had been kept away from their farms and families for far too long and refused to obey orders. Roman military operations were temporarily paralyzed. Instead of responding with force, Villius chose negotiation. He listened to the soldiers' grievances and promised to present their concerns to the Senate. This approach gradually eased tensions and allowed discipline to be restored. With the immediate crisis contained, Villius advanced and established a camp near a narrow gorge along the Aegean River. Philip V of Macedon had already arrived in the area and positioned his army in a strong defensive position, controlling the main route from Apollonia into Macedon. However, Villius' command soon ended. Shortly after encamping, he was replaced by Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a member of the patrician Quinctia family. A committed Philhellene, Flamininus had previously distinguished himself as governor of Tarentum. In 198 BCE, despite being under the legal age, he was elected consul and set out for Greece with 3,000 veteran troops, bypassing traditional ceremonial duties in Rome. After reaching the Roman camp on the Aegean River, Titus Quinctius Flamininus relieved Villius of command and sent an envoy to King Philip V, demanding negotiations on traditional Roman terms. The two leaders met on opposite banks of the fast-flowing river, each surrounded by advisors and generals, the water symbolizing the divide between them. Philip tried to guide the talks toward compromise, arguing that each annexed Greek city required separate treatment and proposing that an independent tribunal decide their fate. Flamininus rejected this. He proclaimed that Rome's mission was the liberation of all Greeks from Macedonian rule and made demands he knew Philip would refuse. Flamininus insisted that Philip abandon Thessaly, a region belonging to Macedon for more than a century. The demand was deliberately unreasonable. Philip broke off negotiations and withdrew to his strong defensive position along the river and surrounding hills. Flamininus acted immediately. He ordered missile troops and light infantry to skirmish aggressively, drawing the Macedonians into projectile exchanges and fixing their attention on the river line. While this diversion continued, Flamininus secretly dispatched 4,300 selected legionaries on a hazardous flanking march through the mountains. Guided by the Epirote noble Charops, the Romans followed hidden paths and moved into position behind Philip's army. Once the flanking force was ready, Flamininus advanced. Realizing the danger of encirclement, the Macedonians abandoned their positions and fled. Philip's army avoided destruction, but the retreat cost him his vital baggage train. More damaging was the loss of confidence among Macedon's Greek allies. As Philip withdrew toward Macedon with a battered army, many supporters defected to Rome or chose neutrality, including the powerful Achaean League. Despite this success, the campaign proved indecisive, and Flamininus became bogged down in a siege at Atrax before retiring for the winter. As the war dragged on, Philip prepared for a final showdown the following year, conscripting not only seasoned soldiers but also youths and elderly men to fill his ranks. Attempts at peace collapsed when the ambitious Roman commander Titus Quinctius Flamininus had his command extended and abruptly abandoned negotiations. In the spring of 197 BC, Philip advanced south into Thessaly and halted at the town of Pherai. There, his army foraged aggressively for supplies and even encountered Roman scouting parties. Once Flamininus learned of Philip's movements, he led his forces north from Boeotia, determined to intercept the Macedonian king before he could retreat. On a cold, fog-shrouded morning, the two armies finally drew close near a series of rolling hills known as cynocephaly. As both sides struggled to see clearly through the mist, contact was made along the slopes, setting the stage for a decisive battle. Before examining the clash itself, it is important to understand the forces each commander brought to the field. Flamininus commanded a powerful and diverse army. His corps consisted of 2 Roman legions and 2 allied legions, numbering roughly 20,000 heavily armed infantry, many of them hardened veterans of the Second Punic War. These were supported by 2,000 velites, 2,500 cavalry, and 20 war elephants guarding the flanks. Greek allies strengthened his host, including light troops from Epirus, Cretan archers, and substantial Aetolian infantry and cavalry. In total, Flamininus fielded around 32,000 men. Philip's army was smaller but formidable. It centered on 16,000 Sarissa-armed phalangites, supported by elite peltasts, Balkan mercenaries, Greek hoplites, and Macedonian and Thessalian cavalry. Both armies awaited fate, unaware this encounter would redefine warfare between phalanx and legion forever for history. Each commander knew the enemy was close, yet the thick morning fog disoriented both armies. Philip advanced at dawn and sent fast skirmishers to the crest of the Cynocephaly ridge to gain visibility. As they reached the summit, they suddenly encountered 10 Roman cavalry squadrons supported by 1,000 velites emerging from the mist. A sharp clash followed, causing losses on both sides, but messengers from each force managed to report the encounter to their commanders. Flamininus responded immediately. He dispatched 2,000 Aetolian infantry and 500 cavalry to support his men on the ridge. Their arrival shifted momentum toward the Romans, forcing the Antigonid skirmishers to fall back uphill while urgently calling for aid from Philip. Although the king hesitated to fight on such broken ground, he refused to abandon his troops and sent 3,500 cavalry and mercenary infantry to reinforce them. With these reinforcements, the balance changed once more. The Macedonian force pressed forward, driving the Romans back down the slope. Polybius records that the Roman detachment came close to being completely routed, a disaster narrowly avoided due to aggressive harassment and skilled skirmishing by the Aetolian allies. As the morning wore on, the rising sun began to lift the fog. The fighting on the hillside became visible to the entire Roman army below. Flamininus and his soldiers could now clearly see their advanced troops being pushed back. This sight shook Roman morale, as defeat seemed imminent. However, their commander acted decisively. He ordered the legions to form into full battle array at the foot of the slope. Before committing them to combat, Flamininus addressed his men. Drawing on his political experience and command presence, he reminded them of past victories, declaring that they had faced these opponents and defeated them before. His words steadied the army and prepared them for the coming battle. As the skirmish ended, jubilant Antigonid light troops sent swift messages to King Philip, urging him to strike while fortune favored them. Philip agreed, ordering the army to deploy at once. The clash had come too suddenly, however, and nearly half his men were still scattered while foraging. With little choice, the king formed only the troops at hand, instructing his general Nicanor to follow with the remainder once they returned. Taking position on the right, Philip personally led his phalanx up the rising ground, intent on crushing the Romans through sheer weight and speed. The advance was screened by the Aegean peltasts, while cavalry guarded the exposed flank. Across the ridge, Titus Quinctius Flamininus moved forward with only the left wing of his line, intending merely to support the skirmish that still raged between the scouts. The sudden arrival of heavy infantry shifted the fight. Macedonian skirmishers were driven back up the slope, many cut down as others ran toward their king. Now two half-armies climbed opposite sides of the same hill, unknowingly converging. A thin fog lingered over the heights, muffling sound and blurring vision, leaving both commanders unaware of the danger ahead. Because of this haze, the Roman left failed to notice nearly 8,000 Macedonians cresting the ridge before them. Moments later, the mist thinned and the opposing lines abruptly came into view. The phalangites reacted instantly, forming into double depth, leveling their sarissas and surging downhill. Caught while still deploying, the Roman infantry faced a sudden, thundering charge that threatened to sweep them from the slope. For a heartbeat, confusion reigned, steel flashed, orders vanished, and fate balanced on momentum alone there. The remnants of Flamininus' scouting force barely managed to form up before the phalangists hit them. Metal pike heads smashed against the solid Roman shields, and the sheer force of the downhill charge, combined with the double depth of the Macedonian phalanx, began to shove the legionaries backward step by step. On the wings, Antigonid cavalry collided with Roman horsemen while light infantry traded missiles, yet the true struggle raged in the center. The Roman left fought with determination and refused to break, but it was steadily ground down by the dense forest of pikes pressing forward without mercy. At first, the encounter favored Philip. The pressure increased further when Nicanor's larger detachment appeared over the ridge on the king's left, marching hurriedly and without proper order. Flamininus rode behind his strained left flank, shouting encouragement and trying to restore cohesion, but the line continued to buckle as it was driven closer to the Roman camp. Seeing that his left wing could not hold much longer, the Philhellene commander turned his horse and galloped toward the uncommitted Roman right, now protected by the intimidating presence of war elephants. Reaching this sector, Flamininus immediately ordered an attack against Nicanor's disorganized troops, many of whom were still arriving or had failed to form ranks at all. Caught in confusion, the Macedonian phalangists, normally the backbone of Philip's army, were helpless without their rigid formation. The Roman assault smashed into them with devastating effect. Numerous Macedonians were cut down where they stood, while others fled in panic and were relentlessly pursued by the advancing legionaries. For a moment, the outcome seemed uncertain. Philip had broken the Roman left, while Flamininus had annihilated Nicanor's force. At that critical instant, an unnamed Roman tribune, trusted by his men, seized the opportunity. The Roman right wing managed to halt roughly 20 maniples, amounting to around 2,500 soldiers, most of whom were likely experienced triarii. Meanwhile, the situation on the Roman left had become increasingly dangerous, as Philip's Macedonian phalanx pushed forward with apparent success. Observing the crisis, an unnamed Roman military tribune made a decisive and independent decision. Gathering his disciplined troops, he marched them swiftly across the ridge, separating the two forces, and struck the Macedonian phalanx from the rear. At the same moment, the exhausted but enraged Roman legionaries on the left wing, who had endured hours of relentless pressure, renewed their assault with fresh determination. This sudden two-sided attack proved devastating. The rigid and inflexible Macedonian phalanx, designed for frontal combat only, began to lose cohesion. Its long sarissas became a hindrance rather than an advantage, and formations broke apart. Roman soldiers surged into the gaps, cutting down phalangists in large numbers. King Philip V rode frantically along the line, shouting orders and attempting to rally his men, but the collapse was too sudden and too complete. Realizing the battle was lost, he abandoned the field and fled. What followed was a brutal and chaotic slaughter. As Roman troops overran the enemy, a group of Macedonian soldiers attempted to surrender by raising their pikes straight into the air, following traditional custom. The legionaries, consumed by fury after hours of fighting, ignored the gesture and killed them regardless. The battle ended in a decisive Roman victory, proving the superiority of the legion over the Macedonian phalanx once and for all. Roman losses were relatively light, around 700 dead, most from the battered left wing. Macedonian casualties were catastrophic, with roughly 8,000 killed and 5,000 captured. The subsequent peace shattered Macedon's power, reducing Philip to a dependent client of Rome and ending any realistic hope of revival. During the Isthmian Games of 196 BCE, the Roman commander Titus Quinctius Flamininus mounted the speaker's platform before a vast Greek audience. In a carefully staged proclamation, he announced that the Roman Senate, the army, and the consul himself would leave the Greeks free, ungarrisoned, untaxed, and self-governing after more than a century of Macedonian domination. At first stunned into silence, the crowd soon erupted into jubilation. Flamininus was hailed as a liberator, mobbed during the celebrations, and overwhelmed with honors from grateful city-states eager to display their loyalty. News of the victory at Cynocephaly and the declaration at the Games reached Rome to equal acclaim. The Senate decreed 5 days of public thanksgiving, an extraordinary honor reflecting the scale of the achievement. Flamininus Dignitas, as general and statesman, stood higher than at any other point in his career. Yet the Isthmian Games were not only a moment of celebration. Among the crowds, Flamininus also received envoys sent by King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. They came to congratulate the consul and reassure Rome of their king's peaceful intentions. Instead, they were met with Roman severity. Flamininus demanded that Antiochus keep away from Greek cities, withdraw existing garrisons, and abandon any plan to cross into Greece. The envoys returned east with these demands. At that time, Antiochus III, known as the Great, was concluding the Fifth Syrian War against the Ptolemies of Egypt. Victorious, he forged the largest empire of the age, seizing Coria, Lycia, Cilicia, Coele-Syria, and other Asian territories. Confident in his power and reputation as a brilliant commander, Antiochus resented Roman interference in Greek affairs and the public rebuke of his diplomats. This tension marked the opening stage of a confrontation between Rome and Seleucid ambition. In this phase, Antiochus began assembling a fleet along the southern coast of Asia Minor, likely with Egypt in mind as his next target. Yet the westward movement of his ships alarmed Rhodes. The island lacked the strength to challenge the Seleucids on land, but its navy dominated the seas. To avoid conflict, Antiochus offered concessions. Halicarnassus would be left to the Rhodians, and no Seleucid base would be established on Samos. In return, Rhodes allowed his fleet safe passage through its waters. War was thus averted. In 196 BC, Antiochus moved swiftly to occupy the remaining Ptolemaic possessions in Asia Minor, most importantly Ephesus, a strategic and symbolic prize. From there, he turned his attention toward the weakened Macedonian sphere. Marching north, he captured Abydos and Ilium, gaining a commanding position near the Hellespont and opening a clear route into Europe. These advances unsettled neighboring cities. Lampsacus, fearing it would be next, took a remarkable step that reflected the changing balance of power. It sent envoys to Rome seeking protection. Although Thracian tribes formally controlled much of the region, Antiochus understood that presenting himself as a restorer of Hellenic order would appeal to Greek communities. Acting on this logic, he crossed the Hellespont, seized Chersonesos, and laid siege to Mydaidos. When Mydaidos fell, resistance elsewhere collapsed, and other cities submitted without a fight. Antiochus then reinforced his authority by rebuilding Lysimachia, a move that effectively sealed control over the Gallipoli Peninsula. While some Greeks admired his actions, Rome interpreted the occupation of Gallipoli as a direct violation of its ultimatum. This decision marked the beginning of open confrontation, transforming cautious diplomacy into inevitable war and drawing the Mediterranean powers toward a struggle that would reshape the Eastern world forever. Roman politics at this time revolved around two towering figures, Titus Quinctius Flamininus, the victor of Cynocephaly, and Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Carthage. Scipio argued for immediate military action in Greece, convinced Rome should strike before its rivals recovered. Flamininus led the peace faction in the Senate and successfully blocked this aggressive policy. Instead, Rome turned to diplomacy and sent an embassy to Lysimachia with firm demands. Antiochus III must withdraw from Europe and restore the Ptolemies' former territories in Asia Minor. When the envoys arrived, circumstances had already changed. Antiochus had made peace with Egypt by marrying his daughter to the young Ptolemy V. He claimed war was now impossible, as Ptolemy was his son-in-law. As negotiations continued, news arrived that the Ptolemaic king had died. Antiochus immediately broke off talks and rushed to Ephesus, then to Antioch, reinforcing Roman suspicions about his ambitions. The details are unclear, but Antiochus soon attempted an invasion of Cyprus. The expedition failed, either because of a storm or a mutiny. After returning to shore, he prepared to attack Egypt directly, only to learn that Ptolemy was still alive. The campaign ended before it began. Antiochus renewed peace with his son-in-law and returned to Ephesus. During this period, Antiochus relied on diplomacy to improve his position. Pergamon, ruled by the Attalids, was a traditional rival, so he offered his daughter Antiochus in marriage to King Eumenes II. Eumenes refused, preferring alliance with Rome. Undeterred, Antiochus formed a marriage alliance with Cappadocia and sent rich gifts to the Galatians, hoping to secure support from their feared Celtic warriors. These maneuvers temporarily stabilized his realm, but failed to ease Roman hostility, which continued growing as Eastern politics became increasingly unstable for Rome. In 194 BC, a single episode revealed how tightly connected the ancient world had become, even as it deepened diplomatic tensions for those living through it. Hannibal Barca, the legendary Carthaginian commander, was driven into exile and reached the Seleucid court at Ephesus, hoping to serve as a mercenary general. King Antiochus welcomed him courteously yet cautiously, fearing that Hannibal's reputation might eclipse his own authority, and therefore kept him at a distance. Roman leaders, alarmed by Hannibal's presence, dispatched envoys to the Seleucid court. These diplomats intentionally focused their attention on Hannibal rather than Antiochus, attempting to create suspicion between the king and his guest. Realizing that this strategy placed him in serious danger, Hannibal recounted the famous oath forced upon him by his father, Hamilcar, binding him to eternal hatred of Rome. This declaration immediately raised his status and trust within the Seleucid court. From 193 to 192 BC, Rome and the Seleucid kingdom continued negotiations, largely over Seleucid ambitions in Europe, but despite repeated exchanges, diplomacy failed. The ancient Mediterranean was on the brink of transformation. Two ambitious rulers, Philip V of Macedon and Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, set their sights on the weakening territories of the Ptolemies, igniting conflicts that would forever reshape history.